Hi, I'm Mitch, and welcome to the Restoration Road, where my guest today is Tim Smith. Tim will authentically share his story of how God has moved in his life and used him to bring his restoration to others. Tim, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
I've been looking so forward to this.
As have I.
I'd like you to talk about your dad and growing up in Michigan and how he decides to get in the ministry.
Yeah, Dad was from a very successful farm family in Michigan. They had a lot of acres, a couple thousand as I recall, and hundreds of head of cattle. And farming was everything in their family. And Dad, in I think 1958, won the FFA Farmer of Michigan Award.
That'd be a big deal.
It was a big deal. I think there were 18,000 people going for it, and he was selected and got to meet the governor, and it was a pretty big deal. So as an 18-year-old, he and their family were very successful. And so he met Mom, they got married, and they were in it. They were a successful farm family, and he was growing rapidly in his faith, and he felt God call him one day, and it was unmistakable. Then he needed to go into the ministry full time.
A prompting in his spirit?
Yeah, just a deep prompting. It was convicting, it was compelling. There was no doubt. In fact, he's told me a number of times, never go into the ministry unless you can see yourself doing nothing else. And that's the way he felt. So he and Mom came to Fort Wayne Bible College in 1964. And that's how our family moved from Michigan to Fort Wayne. And then I was born at the end in 1968 here in Fort Wayne. And then we moved to Dallas in 1968 for 4 years of seminary at Dallas Theological Seminary. Came back and he started, well, he didn't start the church. He took the lead pastor position at what was then New Haven Baptist Church in New Haven. So
you're in New Haven, and it's probably early 70s, and you grow up there?
Yeah. Yep, grew up in New Haven Middle School, New Haven High School, graduated from New Haven High School. Met my wife then, didn't date her in high school, but went on to IPFW, now Purdue Fort Wayne, and then did an internship in the Bush Quail White House. And that's sort of where I got a little bit of a political interest.
We're gonna pick up on that. What sports did you play?
Well, in high school, I played football, wrestling, and baseball. And in my personal spiritual journey, I am certain, in retrospect, that I was taking it too seriously. And I was putting it on a pedestal. And so I ended up developing a bone disease in one of my knees, and I had to have 3 knee operations. And those knee operations took me out of football and wrestling my junior and senior year of high school. And I could only play baseball. In fact, my junior year of baseball, I could only DH. I couldn't even play in the field. But my senior year went well, and I got a baseball scholarship to IPFW. So I played 1 year of baseball at IPFW.
Way to go.
When it was D2.
That's still awesome. When you and I were around high school age, International Harvester leaves Fort Wayne, and you watched your mom and dad go through some tough stuff. I'd like you to describe that.
So our church, as I mentioned, was in New Haven, and New Haven at the time had about 6,000 people. Well, Harvester at its peak employed about 10,000 people. And Harvester is literally in between New Haven and Fort Wayne, and a huge percentage of New Haven was impacted then by International Harvester. Well, when they decided to leave town in the early 80s, our church went from about 150 people to about 40 people. And there were 8 years in the 80s when Dad was making in the teens and did not get a raise for 8 years in a row. Yeah, learned a lot.
I bet you did.
Yeah.
Learn how to survive.
Yeah. Coincidentally, my wife's father, we weren't dating at the time, but he was one of those impacted from International Harvester. He was out of work for 7 or 8 years and was one, like hundreds of others, who ended up traveling every day to Springfield, Ohio, 2.5 hours each way, 5 hours in the car for 9 years, just to get that UAW and Harvester pension. So, yeah, Harvester made a big impact.
Yeah, huge. Tell me about Angie and how that relationship clicked.
Yeah. My wife, Ange, was 2 years behind me in high school, and I was the head of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and we would oftentimes debate theology at the end of those FCA meetings. Didn't mean much to her, might not have meant much to many people, Mitch. Well, so I graduated high school, and she went on the Florida campus life trip. Yeah. And she started her relationship with Christ on that Florida campus life trip with Larry Lance and Mick Baker and guys who I still consider friends today. Yeah, 1980, probably 87. And she came back a new person, spiritually renewed. The old was gone, the new was come, and she had come, and she knew that she needed to be in the Word. She knew she needed to be doing a few things differently. Now, she was raised in a pretty godly Catholic house. Her mom, very devout. Both her mom and her dad today attend Grace Gathering with us, but I intend, and I do respect very much the house they grew up in and what they taught Ange. Well, Ange, remembering those FCA meetings, called me up and said, can we talk? And so we started talking about all kinds of passages and the differences between Catholicism and some of the ways that I grew up. And it was through that friendship that we eventually started dating and eventually got married.
Wow. Are you ever thinking about being a pastor in that time period?
The lead pastor who preaches every Sunday, who does the hospital, the traditional pastor, never really felt a call to that.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about the professor that you and I both had who invited you to that internship with the Bush Quail White House. So
I was a political science major at IPFW, and my freshman year I had a political science professor named Georgia Olmschneider. It is an understatement to say that Georgia and I came from different sides of the political spectrum. But I loved her.
Me
and
too.
She treated me more than fairly.
Yeah.
In fact, she encouraged the debate and the discourse in class. And she would go on to invite me to various honors classes that she taught. And Georgia had every reason not to help me. Yet, when one of her former students landed in the Bush Quail White House as a result of the election, she pulled me aside one day and said, hey, I have a contact in the Vice President Quail administration if you would like to consider an internship. And it was from that, Mitch, that I did end up as an intern in the Vice President's office in Washington, D.C. And it was one of the best experiences of my life. And I credit and thank Georgia for that. I learned a lot about loving and respecting other people, even when you disagree on almost anything. I have no idea what Georgia believes from a spiritual perspective. I don't think we ever talked about it. But I know that she cared for me and she helped me.
Georgia taught me 2 classes, and I just loved her too.
Yep.
She was awesome.
Yep.
You worked with Mark Sauter and Dan Coates?
So fortunately, when I was interning in what was mostly the old executive office building, I got to go to the West Wing a few times. Most interns don't get to. I did that during the days, and then at night I would hop on the Metro and I'd go over to Capitol Hill when U.S. Senator Dan Coates was in office and Mark Sauter was his legislative director. And so I had the privilege of working with Mark just as a volunteer. And one quick story about Mark, I wanted to go visit a group called the Rutherford Institute. The Rutherford Institute is a First Amendment conservative Christian think tank and defender of First Amendment church-state freedom. And I didn't have a car. And Mark, who didn't know me very well, offered me to drive his car. And so I did. And thus started a friendship with Mark. He eventually would become congressman, of course, and that was pretty neat.
Well, you're riding the Metro home in the summer and you feel a pain in your chest and you don't know what it is. How did all that unfold? Yeah,
so with 2 weeks to go in the summer internship, I was riding the same Metro and I felt this sharp pain, implosion in my chest. I had no idea what it was, but it was very painful. Long story short, I was living on Embassy Row, 32nd Street Northwest.
Beautiful.
Beautiful place. I think my neighbors were 2 embassies, maybe Australian and Singapore. I'm not sure, but the elderly lady that I lived with had just been widowed, and her son was a Georgetown First Amendment law professor, and he was coming over that night for dinner. So in spite of the pain, I was thinking about going to law school, and I really wanted to meet him. So I just struggled through it, and we ate, and I ended up in bed, hurt all night. Long story short, the next day, she takes me to work, and the White House has a medical complex within the walls of the White House. And that was the morning that the interns for the vice president, there were 7 of us, were supposed to have breakfast with the vice president just as a thank you. And that's a big deal when you're an intern.
Yeah.
And so I go to the medical center, and they diagnose me with a collapsed lung. And they say, look, it's been down 16, 17 hours. This is emergent. You need to get to the hospital now. And I said, well, I'm supposed to have breakfast with the vice president. Could I just go get my picture taken? So I did. And to this day, I have a picture shaking the vice president's hand with a collapsed lung. Here's the best part of the story, Mitch. They take me down a back elevator, which is as private as it sounds. And they put me in one of the vice president's cars, black car, seal on the side. And the driver says to my boss, I understand this is a medical emergency. Is that true? She says, it is. He has a collapsed lung. It's been down. The doctor says it's emergent. He reaches down. He gets a blue light. He puts a blue light on top of the black vice presidential car. And we literally peel out of the White House, and the iron gates open, and down Pennsylvania Avenue to, I think it was George Washington Medical Center. And I get there, and they took care of me. And I was actually told the same healthcare providers that helped me were part of the team that helped President Reagan actually when he got shot by John Hinckley. So that was a good story.
That is really, really cool on how they got you there, and then the group that ends up taking care of you. So you're engaged and married, and you work in Rick Hawk's congressional campaign, and did you manage Paul Helmke's re-election campaign?
So came back from D.C. Rick Hawks was kind enough to hire me to lead his volunteer network. That was a phenomenal experience. If I know anything about public speaking, I probably learned it from observing Rick for 10 months.
Yeah.
One of the best public speakers I know.
Oh, yeah.
Love he and Kathy dearly to this day. And then I moved right into managing Paul Helmke's re-election campaign in 1991. Was accepted to law school in Indianapolis during that time, and Paul was nice enough to let me go. So my new bride and I moved to Indianapolis, where the first year of law school, we had our first child. The second year of law school, we had our second child. The third year of law school, we had our third child.
Good thing you weren't there for 9 years.
yeah, that's right. That's right. That was good.
You met with somebody who was a mentor of mine for at least a decade about determining whether you were going to do law school. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So Mitch Kruse was a lawyer here in Auburn, your relation, of course, and he happened to be the lawyer who helped our church at times. Now, I don't know, Mitch, if Daryl ever charged us a penny. I do know that he helped us a few times. And so based on that relationship, when I was thinking about law school, Dad encouraged me to go see Daryl. And this would have been, probably the late 80s, 87, 88. And I just remember sitting in Daryl's office thinking to myself, this is a smart, wise man, and I should probably listen. And I don't remember anything really noteworthy. There was no one line that stuck with me. But I do remember very vividly thinking, if this is what a law degree can help you do, that is help people, help churches, help organizations, doing it humbly and submissively, which are the words I remember him by, I'm interested. And that had a big impact on me.
That's awesome. Big impact on me, too, that he made. Are you in law school when you get the letter to report to the dean's office?
Yeah. So unbeknownst, so my freshman year, I applied for a job that I should not have gotten. One of the many God moments in my life. The job posting required a second-year student with a GPA of a certain level. And I was a first-year law student, and my GPA was not of that certain level. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't that. I got the clerkship, to my great surprise. I truly wasn't qualified. And so the last portion of my first year, and then full-time between my first and second year, I worked for this large 5,000-employee corporation. And they offered me a chance to stay and work full-time. And by this time, I had 1.5 children, and they were going to pay for a little bit of my law school, and it was a good deal. So I said yes. So I started taking a full load of law classes at night, and I never changed my plan to graduate in 3 years. And in fact, I stayed on course. Until my third semester, halfway through, and I got a letter from the dean, and it said, you will report to the dean's office on this day and time. I had no idea what it was. So I show up, and the dean of students at the law school says, he was angry. He says, Tim, you've jeopardized this school's accreditation. And I said, well, I don't know what you're talking about. He says, well, you're working full-time, and you're taking more than 10 hours. Apparently at the time, I don't know if it's still the case, but the American Bar Association has a rule that says if you work full-time, you cannot take more than 10 hours of law classes. I didn't know. So they literally dropped me from 2 classes, which meant I was not going to have enough credits to graduate on time. They did allow me to take those 2 courses in the summer, walk the stage with the rest of my class. I did graduate. I did pass the classes. I did pass the bar.
Great job.
And I'm back. But yeah, that was a little scary moment.
Do you work with MedPro right out of the gate?
Yeah. So I take the bar exam on a Thursday and Friday, and my wife and I, and now 3 children, move back to Allen County, and I start working with Medical Protective the next Tuesday.
You've never left?
Still there to this day.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
25th year.
Wow. You have your fourth and fifth child,
Yeah, fourth child 1 year later and fifth child a year after that.
and you went through a miscarriage. Can you talk about how you navigated through those waters?
Yeah. I will tell you that I was obtuse as to the pain of miscarriages before we had one. But it's hard. You know, Ange was 4 months along, and that's a little later than some miscarriages. Everyone's hard, whether it doesn't matter when, they're all hard. And so we would have had six children in 6 years, but we have 5.
You had this political spark inside you, probably a passion, but you submitted to Angie's desire that you wouldn't enter into the fray. I think you ran in the special caucus when my Uncle Dennis ran for the state senate in that same caucus in 2004.
Yeah. So we moved home in '94, and now 3, 4, 5 children, and Ange and I just had an agreement that I was going to put politics on the back burner, and we were going to raise our children the best we could in the way of the Lord, get involved in our church, Grace Gathering Church in New Haven, now in Fort Wayne as well. And so that's what we did. And then in 2004, a sitting state senator passed away. And there was a 3-week special election. It's called a caucus, when only the sitting Republican precinct chairs get to vote. And so it was 3 weeks, and there were 100 people in the electorate, and my wife said, yeah, give it a shot. There were 7, and I hadn't done anything in 10 years. There were 7 people running, one of whom is your relative, current sitting state senator, Dennis Kruse. Dennis got first, I got second. There were 5 others, and I can assure you, I'm the only person on the planet who remembers I got second in a state senate caucus. I don't think anybody else remembers. But I told Dennis at the time that if I didn't win, I hoped he would win. And to this day, he's my state senator. He's a phenomenal, godly, Christian, wise man, and I'm glad he won.
Well, in 2016, Angie goes on a ministry trip to Kentucky. What unfolded there?
Yeah. So, we're married in '89, and we have our 5 children, and we raise them, and we do all the things that young families do. And with the exception of this 3-week sprint for state senate caucus, there was no politics. I helped behind the scenes, a few candidates, a few friends, but we did what we set out to do, which was raise the family, build a career, put a little money in the bank, and do the best that we could to expand God's kingdom through the church and our neighborhood and youth sports. And she felt nudged that week, Mitch, that for 25 years, she got to live her dream of raising our children. And she really felt God nudge her and say, it's time for Tim to pursue his dream of public service through possibly running for office. Can you imagine a 25-year, kind of marital understanding?
Yeah, I get it.
This is life.
Yeah.
And then out of the blue, that's what she came up with. And we had no plans. And so I think we probably told my dad, we probably told our pastor. I don't think we told anybody else. We committed to pray about it for 6 months, and so we did. But it was the same prayer that I and tens of millions of Christians, hundreds of millions probably, billions probably, have prayed, and that's, hey, God, what's your will?
Yeah.
Which direction do you want us to go?
Yeah.
That's not easy, but you hear the Spirit's voice, you listen to wise counsel, you see what the Word has to say, you consider your own giftedness in relation to what the job requires. And 6 months after, we were pretty in deep in this prayer process and discussion, and someone asked me to meet and encouraged me to run for mayor of Fort Wayne.
Romans 8:28 says all things work together for good for those who love the Lord, called according to his purpose. But what is good? And it's cool that Paul says it in the very next verse. 8:29 in Romans is God's definition of success, and it's to be shaped like his son, to be shaped like Christ. And no matter what happens, the fact that you're obedient to this prompting, he's going to shape you to be like Christ, no matter what happens.
Yeah, amen. I view it like praying for salvation for somebody, praying for the healing of somebody. God calls us to pray and to communicate the truth of the gospel, to pray earnestly for the healing of others. But God has to do the converting with salvation. God has to do the healing. I think it was Augustine who said, I work like it's all up to me and pray like it's all up to God. And that, whether it was him or not, that has become a mantra in my life.
I think you also said, without God, man cannot. Without man, God will not. So I love how all that ties together. I can't let you go without you talking about our mutual friend, Joe Cox. You had an amazing journey with him. You knew him longer than I did. Wonderful guy.
Yep. I think Joe and I first met when when we were 12. They showed up at our church one day, and we were neighbors in New Haven, and we became fast friends. In fact, all through high school, we were close friends. Probably would have said best friends. Certainly did. I was the best man in his wedding. He was the best man in my wedding. And he went to the Marines. And so he took his young bride, Ange Burkett, down to North Carolina. And shortly thereafter, she was diagnosed with cancer, and it was liver cancer. And so we walked with them through that process. And liver cancer didn't at the time, I'm not sure it does now, but it didn't respond well to chemo and radiation. So there were a couple surgeries. And over 5 years, she slipped away. They had their first daughter, who was about 5 at the time that Ange was near death. And they had a son, Joseph, who was about 1 at the time. And Ange found blood in Joseph's diaper one day. And, as the parent of 5, I can't imagine anything so scary. And this is when Ange was at the end of her life. And Joe and Ange faced the decision to either have their son treated for what turned out to be a type of kidney cancer, a Wilms tumor, as I recall, or stay with Ange while she probably lived her final few weeks. Joe and Ange made a decision to stay, and my wife, Ange, and I were so fortunate to walk with them through that time. I remember I was with Joe the night Ange passed away. I was there late. And I think I was either on my way home or I just got home, and he called and said she passed. And so immediately Joe started treating Joseph's cancer. And again, I was blessed to be with him. Well, Joe and his daughter, Kristen, at about 4 or 5, and their son, Joseph, at 1, ended up moving into our basement in New Haven. And a bunch of guys from church got together, and we, finished an unfinished basement and had bedrooms for both of them, and it was kitchen, and it was great. They lived with us for about a year.
Wow.
And during that time, Mitch, this is the best part of the story. Joe's down getting Joseph treated at Riley, and he meets this woman named Diana, who turns out went to the same church that he went to, Blackhawk. Turns out was from New Haven. Turns out lived 8 or 9 houses down from me. Joe and Diana started dating. They would eventually get married. Had a great marriage. Diana had been...
you got your basement back?
I got my basement back. Diana had been a widower herself. Her first husband died and left her with 4 kids. I remember talking to Joe about it. It's hard to blend families, even when it's death and not divorce.
Yes.
Still hard. But Joe and Diana are godly people who put Christ first, each other second, and their kids third. And they raised 6 good, godly kids. Well, fast forward to just a couple years ago, and our mutual friend Joe was on the job in Northeast Ohio. Probably had a massive heart attack on the job, had just responded to a domestic call at a home in the country, got in his car and was gone. And I remember hearing about it first thing the next morning, and I drove to Diana's as early as I could. There was a cop sitting outside the house. It was early. Light had just broken. And I hadn't talked to Diana, and I didn't know what to do, and so I walked up to this police officer, and he got out, and I explained who I was, and police officers go through a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot. And I never met this man. He was gentle and loving. I remember he gave me a big hug. Hugging a stranger in the middle of the street. He encouraged me to knock on the door, and I didn't know if Diana was up. She comes to the door, and we talked about it. And well, I was honored. She asked me to speak at Joe's funeral, and so I recounted all the fun stories, but most importantly, because Joe absolutely would have wanted nothing else just got to share the gospel in very simple terms that day. Yeah.
Praise the Lord. Thank you for sharing that. I know it's not easy, but there's just something about him and the whole story that you shared that is inspirational to so many.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite Bible verse?
Yeah, it's changed over the years. For probably 45 years, it was 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test everything and hold on to the good. I now actually have a deeper appreciation of what that verse means in the context of 1 Thessalonians 5. It's in the prophetic context. But another one that has meant a lot to me is Psalm 121. Our family was on a vacation in Colorado, and I was sitting at the base of a mountain one morning by myself reading a little bit. And for some reason, I was in that passage. I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And it goes on to talk about how he won't let our feet slip. He isn't sleeping when bad things happen. And so that verse also has been a constant, whether it's the loss of a good friend, whether it's the midst of a difficult campaign, something bad at church, something bad at work, where does our help come from? Our help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth.
Tim, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, my friend.
And that's our prayer for you, is that you would know your help comes from the God of the universe, the maker of heaven and earth. And he is here for you right now, whatever it is that's going on in your life, whether it's a loss of a loved one, whether it's a strain in a marriage, whether it's a broken relationship with a family member, whether it's an economic issue or a business issue, whatever it is, a health issue, God is where your help will come from. Pursue him through prayer. Pursue his people. Get wise counsel, get help, go to a church and get in a small group, or go to the small group you're already in and share with them what's going on in your life and have them come around you and put flesh on God for you. And then go to the Word of God. Maybe read Psalm 121 again and again and again and again and experience what God has for you. He will make you new, and he will use you to bring that restoration to others.
Hi, I'm Beth Fisher. Join us next week on the Restoration Road with Mitch Kruse.